Picture this. You're standing at 14,000 feet. Your heart is hammering against your ribs even though you haven't moved in 10 minutes. Each breath pulls in only 60% of the oxygen it would at sea level. Your fingertips have gone numb. Every instinct in your body is screaming one word: descend. Now picture living here, not visiting, not climbing through on your way to somewhere lower and warmer. Living here permanently, generation after generation, in air this thin, in cold this constant. That's exactly what some of the earliest humans on Earth chose to do. In 2012, archaeologist Kurt Rademacher and his team from the University of Maine were excavating a site called Concusha, a rock shelter tucked into the Peruvian Andes at 4,480 meters above sea level. What they found didn't make sense at first. Stone tools, obsidian blades, the butchered bones of vicuña and guanaco. Signs not of a brief hunting trip, but of sustained, repeated occupation. When the radiocarbon dates came back, they placed humans at Concaicha roughly 12,400 years ago. That's during the last ice age. That's before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth. And it's at an altitude where modern lowlanders dropped in without acclimatization risk pulmonary edema, their lungs filling with fluid within days. The site was published in Science in 2014, and it forced researchers to rethink something they'd assumed for decades. That high altitude was a barrier humans crossed only recently, only reluctantly, only once agriculture gave them a reason to push into marginal land. Concaicha suggested the opposite. Hunter-gatherers weren't pushed into the mountains as a last resort. They went up on purpose, and they stayed. But Concaicha wasn't the first place humans dared to live this high. It wasn't even close. Half a world away in the Ethiopian highlands, there's a site called Fincha Habara, perched at 3,469 meters in the Bale Mountains. In 2019, a team led by archaeologist Götz Ossendorf found something even stranger than Concaicha: evidence that Stone Age humans were living there around 47,000 years ago, and returning again and again for the next 30,000 years. At that altitude, the air is cold enough to freeze exposed skin in winter, and the terrain is mostly Afro-alpine grassland, not exactly rich in calories. So why stay? Ossendorf's team found the answer buried in the ash of ancient hearths, thousands of bones from a giant mole rat called Tachyryctes macrocephalus, an animal that exists almost nowhere else on Earth except these highlands. It turns out the mountain wasn't a barrier at all. It was a pantry, a reliable, defensible, high-protein food source that lowland hunters simply didn't have access to. That single detail flips the whole assumption on its head. These people weren't marooned in the mountains. They were exploiting a niche nobody else could reach. But food alone doesn't explain everything, because staying at altitude isn't just about finding something to eat. It's about surviving air that is quite literally trying to kill you. Here's where the disruption gets biological. At 4,000 meters, atmospheric pressure drops to roughly 60% of sea level. Your body responds by producing more red blood cells to carry what little oxygen it can find, a condition called polycythemia. Over days that helps. Over generations it can start to hurt. Thicker blood raises the risk of chronic mountain sickness, stroke, and complications in pregnancy. And yet populations in the Andes, the Ethiopian highlands, and the Tibetan plateau didn't just survive this pressure. They rewired around it, in 3 completely different ways. That's not the whole story. That's just the setup for something researchers didn't expect to find written into human DNA itself. In 2010, geneticist Rasmus Nielsen and his colleagues at UC Berkeley sequenced the genomes of 50 Tibetans and compared them against lowland Han Chinese populations. They were looking for genetic differences that could explain why Tibetans thrive at altitudes that leave outsiders gasping. What they found was a single gene, EPAS1, that had swept through the Tibetan population with startling speed, genetically speaking almost overnight. Carriers of this EPAS1 variant don't overproduce red blood cells the way lowlanders do when they move to altitude. Instead, their bodies regulate hemoglobin more precisely, using the oxygen available more efficiently rather than just making the blood thicker. In 2014, a follow-up study led by geneticist Emilia Huerta Sanchez traced the origin of this gene even further back, and found it likely came from an extinct human relative, the Denisovans, a population that vanished from the archaeological record more than 40,000 years ago. Modern Tibetans appear to be carrying, in their blood, a survival tool inherited from a species of human that no longer exists. By some estimates, the EPAS, one variant spread through Tibetan populations, in under 3,000 years was one of the fastest cases of natural selection ever documented in any organism, let alone humans. The Andeans took a completely different route. Instead of the EPAS, one shortcut, researchers studying populations around Cerro de Pasco, Peru, a mining city sitting at 4,338 meters, one of the highest cities on Earth, found something closer to brute force adaptation. Andean highlanders tend to show higher blood oxygen saturation, elevated hemoglobin concentration, and measurably larger lung volumes and chest cavities than their lowland relatives. A study published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology found Andean highland populations had chest volumes roughly 14% to 20% larger than genetically related lowland groups. Their bodies didn't find a way around the thin air. They built bigger machinery to process it. Then there's Ethiopia, which broke the pattern a second time. A 2016 study led by geneticist Cynthia Beale examined highlanders in the Semien and Bale Mountains at elevations above 3,500 meters and found something that startled the research team. Normal hemoglobin levels at altitudes where both Andeans and Tibetans show clear physiological adaptation. It was as if their bodies barely registered the thin air at all. Beale's team searched for a dominant gene, the way EPAS1 had explained Tibet, and didn't find one. The genetic mechanism behind Ethiopian highland adaptation remains even now only partly understood. 3 isolated populations, 3 separate mountain ranges, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Ethiopian highlands, separated by tens of thousands of kilometers and tens of thousands of years of independent history. 3 different evolutionary solutions to the exact same problem. Not enough oxygen in the air to sustain a human body the way it evolved to run. And this wasn't cultural knowledge passed between groups. There was no contact, no shared ancestry within the relevant time frame. Just 3 separate populations unaware of each other's existence, each one solving the identical problem of thin air using entirely different biological tools. One borrowed from an extinct species, one built through sheer anatomical scale, one still unexplained. That's the strange part. Altitude sickness isn't a design flaw your species failed to fix. It's a problem that's already been solved, just not in you, and not in one single way, but independently, at least 3 separate times, on 3 separate mountains. Somewhere above 3,000 meters, in 3 different corners of the world, small groups of Ice Age humans looked at air too thin to sustain them and didn't turn back. They stayed anyway, long enough for their children's bodies to change, long enough for hunger and cold and hypoxia to become, quietly, a selection pressure, and for evolution to catch up to ambition. You inherited lungs built for sea level, blood built for a world with more oxygen in every breath than the one your highland ancestors chose to live in. But scattered across the highest, coldest, most unforgiving places on Earth are people whose ancestors simply refused to leave, and whose blood quite literally still remembers it. The genetics explain how these populations survived once they were already living at altitude. They don't explain why anyone climbed up there in the first place. One clue comes from Willamaya Pacha, a high-altitude burial site in the Peruvian Andes at roughly 3,925 meters, excavated by a team led by archaeologist Randy Haas in 2018. Inside one grave, alongside a toolkit of 20 stone artifacts, Haas found the remains of a hunter buried around 9,000 years ago, later identified through protein analysis in the tooth enamel as biologically female. The toolkit included projectile points and hide processing tools, the standard gear of a big game hunter. It forced a rethink of who was doing the dangerous, high-altitude hunting in the first place, but it also confirmed something else. By 9,000 years ago, mountain living wasn't a fringe experiment. It was organized, skilled, and normal. So why go up at all when the valleys below were warmer, lower, and easier to breathe in? Part of the answer is timing. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age was ending. Glaciers that had locked up the high Andes and the Himalayas for millennia were retreating. And behind them, they left something new. Fresh, unclaimed grassland at elevations no human population had ever been able to reach before. For hunter-gatherers competing over territory in the lowlands, that retreating ice line wasn't a hazard. It was empty real estate. You live most likely somewhere your lungs don't have to fight for every breath. But the fact that entire populations of your species looked at the hardest air on Earth and decided it was worth the cost. That's not a footnote in human history. It's a pattern. Wherever the rest of the species avoided, someone eventually moved in anyway.